What would you do if a scrappy 14-year-old boy fixed your car, then vanished before you could repay him? For Silas Cormack, that one selfless act sparked a journey of redemption, discovery, and the power of community. But what happens when the boy's world starts falling apart? And Silas is the only one who can help. A forgotten workshop, a grandfather's fading wisdom, and a town rallying together. This is the story of a lantern that burned brighter than anyone could have imagined. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the quiet town of Elmsworth, casting golden hues across fields of tall grass and maple trees, ablaze in fiery red and orange. The air was crisp, with a whisper of winter on the horizon. Silas Cormack gripped the wheel of his sleek black sedan, the hum of the engine breaking the stillness of the countryside. His face was a mask of controlled detachment, but his mind churned with unspoken grief. This was his first trip back to Elmsworth in over 20 years. A town that once held his roots, but now only housed the ghosts of his past. His father had died 2 weeks earlier, and the farmhouse where he grew up waited for him at the end of the narrow, winding road ahead. As the car sped through the quiet stretch, a sudden jolt snapped Silas out of his thoughts. The unmistakable asterisk, thump, 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 asterisk of a flat tire shattered the serenity. He muttered a curse under his breath and pulled over to the side, kicking up a cloud of dust. Stepping out of the car, Silas surveyed the damage. The rear tire was completely shredded, rubber peeling away like the bark of a tree. He sighed, adjusting his tailored jacket and loosening his silk tie, already feeling the chill of the evening air creeping in. His phone blinked, no service. Of course. Perfect, he muttered. Silas knelt down, staring at the tire as if willing it to fix itself. A faint clinking noise in the distance drew his attention. He squinted, spotting a figure pushing a wheelbarrow along the side of the road. It was a boy, no older than 14, with messy blonde hair and a wiry frame. His clothes were worn, jeans too short for his growing legs, and a patched jacket barely holding together. Despite his ragged appearance, there was a spark in his eyes that Silas couldn't ignore. The boy stopped a few feet away, tilting his head curiously. Flat tire? Silas straightened, brushing dust off his hands. Yeah, no spare, no signal. Just my luck. The boy nodded, stepping closer. His hands, calloused from work, rested easily on the handles of the wheelbarrow, which was filled with rusty bolts, scrap metal, and mismatched tools. I can fix it, he said simply. Silas raised an eyebrow, skepticism flickering across his face. You're a kid. The boy shrugged, his grin mischievous. Name's Harlan Drake, and I know my way around broken things. Got tools right here. Before Silas could protest, Harlan set the wheelbarrow down and began rummaging through it. He pulled out a battered jack and a socket wrench, inspecting them with care. Silas watched, unsure of whether to intervene or let the boy work. You're really going to fix it, just like that? Harlan looked up, his grin widening. It's just a tire, mister. No big deal. Silas stepped back, folding his arms as he observed the boy work. Harlan moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He slid the jack under the car and cranked it up with practiced ease. So, Silas said after a moment, breaking the silence, do you always help strangers on the side of the road? Harlan didn't look up as he loosened the lug nuts. Only the ones who look like they need it, he replied, his tone light but sincere. Silas chuckled dryly. Do I look that helpless? Maybe, Harlan said, flashing him a quick grin before focusing back on the task. Within 15 minutes, the tire was replaced. Harlan wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped back, admiring his work with a nod of satisfaction. Good as new, he said. Silas pulled out his wallet, flipping through the bills. He extended a crisp $100 note toward the boy. Here, for your trouble. Harlan hesitated, his expression shifting. Then, to Silas's surprise, he shook his head. Don't need it, just glad to help. Silas blinked, stunned. What? Take it. It's the least I can do. But Harlan was already pushing his wheelbarrow back toward the road. He called over his shoulder. Keep your money, mister. Just remember, not everything's about dollars and cents. Silas stood there, holding the bill awkwardly in his hand as he watched the boy disappear down the path. The words hung in the air like a challenge. As he climbed back into his car and started the engine, Silas couldn't shake the encounter. Who was this kid? Why would someone with so little ref use $100? He glanced at the empty road ahead, the boy's silhouette already fading into the distance. For the first time in years, something tugged at Silas's carefully guarded heart. The faint morning light seeped through the gaps in the weather-beaten curtains of a small house on the edge of Elmsworth. The house stood crooked on its foundation, its chipped white paint peeling away like bark from an old tree. Despite its worn exterior, the home exuded a quiet resilience, much like its inhabitants. Inside, Harlan Drake moved with practiced efficiency, careful not to make too much noise. His grandfather, Caleb Drake, still rested in his chair by the window, a battered armchair that had long molded to his frame. Caleb, once a robust craftsman and war veteran, now carried the weight of years and blindness, his milky eyes staring at nothing, yet seeming to see everything. Harlan tiptoed past, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was almost 6 a.m. The boy was already dressed in his patched jeans and thick jacket, ready to begin his day. His wheelbarrow, filled with salvaged metal and rusted tools, waited outside. But before he left, he leaned over and placed a gentle hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Grandpa," he whispered, "I'm heading out. I'll be back by lunch." Caleb stirred slightly, his weathered hand reaching out instinctively. "Be careful, boy," he murmured, his voice raspy yet steady. "And don't forget, leave the world brighter than you found it." Harlan smiled, though Caleb couldn't see it. "Always, Grandpa." He stepped outside, breathing in the crisp autumn air. His boots crunched against the gravel path as he grabbed the handles of his wheelbarrow and began his journey. The road ahead was long, winding through fields and junkyards where he scavenged for materials to fix broken tools or sell parts to locals. It was a hard life, but Harlan carried it with the quiet dignity of someone far older than his 14 years. By mid-morning, Harlan had filled his wheelbarrow with odds and ends, a rusted saw blade here, a half-broken wrench there. He'd earned a few dollars fixing a farmer's plow earlier and bartered for some fresh eggs at the market. Every bit helped, but it was never quite enough. The looming property taxes on the house were like a shadow over his every step. Despite the weight of his burdens, Harlan's mind often wandered to his dreams. In his free moments, he tinkered with makeshift contraptions in a small shed behind the house. His latest project was a crude prototype for a tool that could help Caleb navigate the house more easily. A kind of tactile map made of raised pins and wires. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. If I could just learn more, Harlan often thought, his eyes lighting up with ambition. If I had the tools and knowledge, I could build things that really matter. By the time Harlan returned, the sun was high in the sky, and the smell of burning wood wafted through the air. Caleb was awake, sitting by the window with his gnarled hands resting on a blanket. "How'd it go?" Caleb asked as Harlan entered, his head turning slightly toward the sound of the boy's footsteps. "Got a few things," Harlan replied, setting down the wheelbarrow and unloading the metal. "Fixed a plow for old man Turner. He gave me some eggs." Caleb chuckled, a deep rumble that filled the small room. "Eggs are good, better than nothing anyway." Harlan sat on the floor beside his grandfather, pulling out one of his smaller projects, a broken clock he hoped to repair. Caleb's face softened as he listened to the faint clicks of the gears being adjusted. "You've got your mother's hands, you know," Caleb said suddenly, his voice distant. "She could fix anything she touched, even me." Harlan paused, his throat tightening. He didn't remember much about his parents. They had died in a car accident when he was 6, leaving Caleb to raise him. "I just want to do something that helps, Grandpa," Harlan said quietly. "Something real. Something that lasts." Caleb reached out, his hand finding Harlan's and gripping it firmly. "A man is measured by the light he leaves for others to follow," he said, his voice steady despite its rasp. "You're already shining, boy. Don't ever let anyone dim it." As night fell, the wind outside howled through the brittle branches of the maple trees, rattling the old windows of the Drake house. The walls groaned under the pressure, each creak and moan a reminder of the home's fragile state. Inside, the dim glow of a single oil lamp illuminated the modest living room. Caleb sat silently in his chair near the window, his clouded eyes staring into the darkness. His hands, once strong and steady from years of crafting, rested limply on the frayed armrests. The occasional cough escaped his lips, deep and rattling, though he tried to suppress it so Harlan wouldn't notice. At the kitchen table, Harlan sat hunched over, his brow furrowed as he sifted through a stack of letters. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, and their contents painted a grim picture: overdue electricity, mounting medical bills, and the largest weight of all, a final notice from the county threatening foreclosure if the property taxes weren't paid. "I can't show him," Harlan muttered under his breath. His voice was barely audible over the wind's relentless whistle. "It'll only make things worse." The boy leaned back in his chair, letting out a shaky sigh. His gaze fell to the rough, hand-drawn plans for his latest invention, a tactile map designed to help Caleb move around the house more easily. The edges of the paper were smudged with grease and pencil marks, a testament to the hours he had poured into the project. He picked up the map, running his fingers over the raised pins he had carefully installed, and whispered, "If I can finish this, maybe it'll make things a little easier for him." The wind howled louder, rattling the window pane. Caleb shifted slightly in his chair, turning his head toward the sound. "That wind's angry tonight," he said, his voice rasping through the stillness. "Almost feels like it's trying to knock the whole place down." Harlan forced a smile, though Caleb couldn't see it. "It'll hold, Grandpa, like it always does." But as he spoke, his chest tightened. The house had held up for years, weathering countless storms, but the weight of their financial troubles was a different kind of storm, one Harlan wasn't sure they could survive. "We'll figure it out," he muttered to himself, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. The words were more a prayer than a promise. The pile of letters seemed to stare back at him, an ever-present reminder that time was running out. And deep down, despite his determination, Harlan knew that sheer will alone might not be enough. The farmhouse stood at the end of the gravel driveway, framed by towering oak trees that had been there since Silas Cormack was a boy. Time had taken its toll on the house, just as it had on the man who built it. The white paint was faded, the porch sagging slightly, but it was still sturdy, much like Silas's late father. Silas sat in his car for several minutes, staring at the house in silence. His hands gripped the steering wheel, the engine still idling. The memories of this place were a tangle of emotions. Warm summers spent fishing in the creek, the sound of his mother's laughter echoing through the kitchen, and the stern but steady voice of his father. Yet, it had all faded with time, buried beneath decades of career ambitions and the ever-pressing demands of his Manhattan life. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he killed the engine and stepped out. The gravel crunched beneath his expensive shoes, a jarring reminder of how out of place he now felt here. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood and something faintly metallic, like old tools. Silas ran his fingers along the edge of a wooden table in the entryway, his touch stirring a faint layer of dust. His father's presence was everywhere. The living room still had the same armchair where the old man used to sit, a book always in hand. The shelves were lined with woodworking projects, a carved bird, a clock, a simple box that Silas had once admired as a child. It was in the study, though, that Silas found the heart of his father's world. The room was cramped, its walls covered in shelves stacked with books, journals, and tools. A small, weathered desk sat in the corner, papers scattered across its surface, as if the man had just stepped out and would return at any moment. Silas's eyes landed on a leather-bound journal, its edges worn from years of use. Hesitant, he picked it up, the weight of it surprising in his hands. The pages inside were filled with his father's handwriting, steady, deliberate, and deeply familiar. As Silas flipped through the journal, the words seemed to leap off the pages, drawing him back into his father's mind. "It's not what you take with you, but what you leave behind. A legacy isn't money or success. It's how you've treated people, the lives you've touched." Silas frowned, his jaw tightening. He'd heard this sentiment from his father 100 times growing up. Back then, he dismissed it as naive, the ramblings of a man too sentimental for the real world. But now, after years of chasing wealth and prestige, he couldn't shake the feeling that his father might have been right. Another entry caught his eye. "I worry about Silas. He's got a sharp mind, but he doesn't see the value in the small things. I wish he understood that kindness is what truly matters." Silas closed the journal abruptly, a lump forming in his throat. His father had always tried to teach him the importance of community, of giving back. But Silas had been too focused on his own ambitions to listen. As he sat in the study, memories began to resurface unbidden. He was a teenager again, standing on the porch while his father handed a bundle of firewood to a struggling neighbor. "They can't afford to heat their home this winter," his father had said when Silas questioned him. "It's just firewood, but it might mean everything to them." "Why don't they just work harder?" Silas had replied, his voice tinged with the arrogance of youth. His father had sighed, looking at him with a mixture of disappointment and hope. "One day you'll understand. When you do, I hope it won't be too late." The memory hit him like a wave, leaving Silas reeling. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes scanning the room for something, anything that could distract him. Instead, his thoughts drifted to the boy he'd met on the road the day before, Harlan. There had been something about the way the boy worked. Calm, focused, unbothered by the dirt on his hands or the weight of the task. Silas couldn't stop replaying the moment when Harlan refused the money. It wasn't just his ingenuity that struck Silas, but his sincerity. The boy's words echoed in his mind. Not everything's about dollars and cents. For the first time in years, Silas felt a strange, gnawing sense of guilt. He had spent his life building a fortune. Yet, here was a boy with nothing who seemed to have everything Silas lacked: purpose, integrity, and a connection to something deeper. Silas leaned back in his father's old desk chair, staring at the journal still clutched in his hand. The pages might as well have been a mirror, reflecting the cracks in his own life. In that quiet moment, he made a decision. He couldn't undo the years of neglect, the distance he had put between himself and his father's values. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start making things right. The first step was finding the boy. The town of Elmsworth stirred awake under a pale morning sky. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the faint clinking of tools in the hands of early risers echoed through the crisp air. Silas Cormack sat in the driver's seat of his car, parked near the town square, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee from the local diner. He stared at the paper napkin in his hand, on which he'd scribbled the name ****, Harlan Drake, ****. The boy was becoming an enigma in Silas's mind, a puzzle he couldn't ignore. There was something in Harlan's calm confidence and quiet selflessness that had left a mark deeper than Silas expected. Finding him wasn't just about repaying a favor anymore. It felt like a thread he needed to follow to make sense of something larger, though he couldn't yet name it. Silas began his search by revisiting familiar places around Elmsworth. The general store, the post office, even the library. All of them bore remnants of the past, but also the signs of a town quietly adapting to modern times. Conversations with locals yielded fragmented pieces of information about the Drakes. "You're talking about that Drake boy?" asked a mechanic at the garage. His hands were smeared with grease as he wiped them on a rag. "Yeah, I've seen him around. Always fixing things. Kid's got a knack for it. Hard life, though, you know. His grandpa's blind and they've been barely scraping by." "Nice kid," said a shopkeeper, stacking cans on a shelf. "Always polite. Never complains, but you can tell he's carrying a lot on those skinny shoulders." Each interaction painted a clearer picture, and Silas's curiosity grew alongside a pang of guilt. Harlan wasn't just some kid who'd helped him out of kindness. He was someone who gave to others even when he had nothing to spare. As the morning wore on, Silas found himself at Harper's Diner, ****, a small, cozy spot near the town square. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him as he stepped inside. Behind the counter stood Eliza Harper, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and an air of unshakable optimism. "Morning," she greeted, pouring coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. "Haven't seen you around here before. Passing through?" Silas shook his head, hesitating before speaking. "Not exactly. I'm looking for someone, a boy named Harlan Drake." Eliza's hands paused for a moment, her expression softening. "Harlan, huh? That boy's something special. You won't find many like him." "What do you mean?" Silas asked, intrigued. Eliza leaned against the counter, her tone thoughtful. "Harlan's the kind of kid who doesn't just see problems. He fixes them. Broken fence, he's there. Leaky faucet, he'll patch it up. And he does it all with this quiet determination, like he's got something to prove to the world." Silas nodded slowly. "Where can I find him?" Eliza smiled faintly. "Try over by the old Grady farm. I heard he's fixing their generator today. But, she paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. If you're looking to offer him pity, don't bother. That boy's lantern burns brighter than most of us could ever hope for. Her words lingered with Silas as he left the diner. Asterisk lantern. Asterisk, he thought, the metaphor striking a chord. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for anymore. A way to repay Harlan or something deeper, something that might finally fill the void left by his father's absence. The Grady farm was a sprawling piece of land on the outskirts of town, its fields dotted with rusting equipment and sagging fences. As Silas parked his car, he spotted Harlan in the distance, crouched beside a bulky generator that had clearly seen better days. The boy's head was bent in concentration as he adjusted a wrench, his wheelbarrow of tools close at hand. Silas approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Harlan," he called out. The boy looked up, squinting against the sun. His expression shifted from surprise to cautious curiosity. "Mister, what are you doing here?" Silas stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "I've been looking for you." Harlan frowned slightly, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Why?" Silas hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain what had compelled him to track the boy down. Finally, he said, "I wanted to thank you for helping me with the tire." Harlan shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Didn't do it for thanks." "I know," Silas replied quickly, "but you didn't have to do it at all. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't just owe you for fixing my car. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten." Harlan tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What's that?" "That helping people matters," Silas said simply. The town of Elmsworth stirred awake under a pale morning sky. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the faint clinking of tools in the hands of early risers echoed through the crisp air. Silas Cormack sat in the driver's seat of his car, parked near the town square, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee from the local diner. He stared at the paper napkin in his hand, on which he'd scribbled the name, Harlan Drake. The boy was becoming an enigma in Silas's mind, a puzzle he couldn't ignore. There was something in Harlan's calm confidence and quiet selflessness that had left a mark deeper than Silas expected. Finding him wasn't just about repaying a favor anymore. It felt like a thread he needed to follow to make sense of something larger, though he couldn't yet name it. Silas began his search by revisiting familiar places around Elmsworth. The general store, the post office, even the library. All of them bore remnants of the past, but also the signs of a town quietly adapting to modern times. Conversations with locals yielded fragmented pieces of information about the Drakes. "You're talking about that Drake boy?" asked a mechanic at the garage. His hands were smeared with grease as he wiped them on a rag. "Yeah, I've seen him around, always fixing things. Kid's got a knack for it. Hard life, though, you know. His grandpa's blind, and they've been barely scraping by." "Nice kid," said a shopkeeper, stacking cans on a shelf. "Always polite, never complains, but you can tell he's carrying a lot on those skinny shoulders." Each interaction painted a clearer picture, and Silas's curiosity grew alongside a pang of guilt. Harlan wasn't just some kid who'd helped him out of kindness. He was someone who gave to others even when he had nothing to spare. As the morning wore on, Silas found himself at Harper's Diner, a small, cozy spot near the town square. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him as he stepped inside. Behind the counter stood Eliza Harper, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and an air of unshakable optimism. "Morning," she greeted, pouring coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. "Haven't seen you around here before. Passing through." Silas shook his head, hesitating before speaking. "Not exactly. I'm looking for someone, a boy named Harlan Drake." Eliza's hands paused for a moment, her expression softening. "Harlan, huh? That boy's something special. You won't find many like him." "What do you mean?" Silas asked, intrigued. Eliza leaned against the counter, her tone thoughtful. "Harlan's the kind of kid who doesn't just see problems. He fixes them. Broken fence? He's there. Leaky faucet? He'll patch it up. And he does it all with this quiet determination, like he's got something to prove to the world." Silas nodded slowly. "Where can I find him?" Eliza smiled faintly. "Try over by the old Grady farm. I heard he's fixing their generator today, but—" She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "If you're looking to offer him pity, don't bother. That boy's lantern burns brighter than most of us could ever hope for." Her words lingered with Silas as he left the diner. Lantern, he thought, the metaphor striking a chord. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for anymore. A way to repay Harlan or something deeper. Something that might finally fill the void left by his father's absence. The Grady farm was a sprawling piece of land on the outskirts of town, its fields dotted with rusting equipment and sagging fences. As Silas parked his car, he spotted Harlan in the distance, crouched beside a bulky generator that had clearly seen better days. The boy's head was bent in concentration as he adjusted a wrench, his wheelbarrow of tools close at hand. Silas approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Harlan," he called out. The boy looked up, squinting against the sun. His expression shifted from surprise to cautious curiosity. "Mister, what are you doing here?" Silas stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "I've been looking for you." Harlan frowned slightly, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Why?" Silas hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain what had compelled him to track the boy down. Finally, he said, "I wanted to thank you for helping me with the tire." Harlan shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Didn't do it for thanks." "I know," Silas replied quickly, "but you didn't have to do it at all. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't just owe you for fixing my car. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten." Harlan tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What's that?" "That helping people matters," Silas said simply. For a moment, the two stood in silence, the hum of the generator filling the space between them. Then Harlan gestured to the machine. "Well, if you're here to thank me, you can hand me that screwdriver. I'm almost done with this." Silas blinked, surprised, but complied. As he handed over the tool, he couldn't help but smile. By the time Harlan finished repairing the generator, the sun was beginning to set. Silas watched as the boy tested the machine, his face lighting up with quiet satisfaction when it roared to life. "You've got a gift," Silas said as they packed up Harlan's tools. "You ever think about what you want to do with it?" Harlan shrugged, his gaze distant. "I've got a lot to take care of right now. Dreams come later." Silas frowned. But before he could press further, Harlan grabbed his wheelbarrow and started heading down the dirt path toward home. "See you around, mister," the boy called over his shoulder, disappearing into the fading light. Silas stood there for a long moment, his father's words echoing in his mind. "It's not what you take with you, but what you leave behind." The road ahead suddenly felt less clear, but for the first time in years, Silas wanted to figure out where it led. The following morning, a soft fog clung to the streets of Elmsworth as Silas parked in front of the old farmhouse that had once belonged to his father. The air was heavy with the earthy scent of damp leaves, and the faint caw of crows echoed from the distant trees. Silas stood by his car, staring at the horizon, the weight of his father's journal tucked under his arm. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't stop thinking about Harlan. There was something about the boy's resilience and quiet ingenuity that stirred something unfamiliar inside him. It wasn't pity. Harlan wouldn't have accepted it even if it were. No, it was admiration, and maybe even something deeper, a reflection of what Silas had once aspired to be before ambition clouded his vision. Silas made up his mind. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and drove toward the Grady farm, hoping to find the boy again. Silas found Harlan exactly where he expected, tinkering with a rusty tractor under the shadow of an aging barn. The boy was crouched low, his face smeared with grease, his hands deftly working a wrench. "Harlan?" Silas called out, stepping closer. The boy looked up, surprised but not startled. "You again?" he said, standing and wiping his hands on a rag. "I have a proposition," Silas began, his voice measured. Harlan raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "What now?" Silas held up his hands, sensing the boy's wariness. "Look, I've been going through my father's things, and he left behind a lot of old tools and equipment. Most of it's in bad shape, but I figured maybe you could fix some of it. I'll pay you, of course." Harlan studied Silas for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why me? You could take it to any repair shop." "Because I've seen what you can do," Silas replied simply, "and because I'd rather give the work to someone who deserves it." Harlan's expression softened, but he didn't let his guard down entirely. "How much are we talking?" Silas smiled faintly. "Enough to make it worth your time." After a long pause, Harlan nodded. "All right, I'll take a look, but don't expect miracles. Later that afternoon, Silas led Harlan to the small workshop behind the farmhouse. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows, and the air smelled faintly of sawdust and oil. The space was cluttered with boxes of rusting tools, unfinished projects, and wooden carvings Silas's father had made years ago. Harlan's eyes lit up as he surveyed the room, though he tried to hide his excitement. He picked up a cracked hammer, turning it over in his hands. "This place, it's got character," he said quietly. "It was my father's," Silas explained, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "He was always fixing things for the neighbors. I didn't understand it back then, but now—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Harlan set the hammer down and looked at Silas. "You miss him?" Silas hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I do," he admitted finally, "but I didn't always appreciate him when he was here." Harlan nodded, as if he understood more than Silas expected. People don't always say what they mean until it's too late. Over the next few days, Harlan worked in the workshop, meticulously sorting through tools and machinery. Silas often found himself lingering nearby, watching the boy work. Their conversations started out brief and practical, but gradually grew more personal. One afternoon, as Harlan repaired a broken vise, Silas leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "You're good at this," he said. Harlan smirked. "Thanks. Grandpa says I've got the fix-it gene." Silas chuckled. "He's not wrong. So, what's the dream, Harlan? What do you want to do with all this talent?" The boy hesitated, his gaze fixed on the tool in his hands. "I want to build things that matter," he said finally. "Tools that help people, like Grandpa. He used to be a carpenter, but when his eyesight went, everything got harder. I want to make it easier. For him, for others like him." Silas felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. "That's a noble goal," he said softly. Harlan shrugged. "It's just an idea. Not sure it'll ever happen." "Why not?" "Because life doesn't always give you what you want," Harlan replied simply. One evening, as Silas was locking up the workshop, he found himself thinking about the boy's words. Life hadn't given Harlan much, that was clear. Yet he'd found purpose in the scraps he'd been dealt. For Silas, it was a stark contrast to his own life, a life filled with success but devoid of meaning. He realized that helping Harlan wasn't just about fixing tools or giving the boy a few extra dollars. It was about finding a way to make a difference, to finally live up to the legacy his father had left behind. Silas didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. As Silas stood on the porch of the farmhouse that night, the stars stretched endlessly above him. The journal lay open on the table beside him. The words of his father etched in his mind. "Kindness isn't a transaction, it's a seed. Plant it, and it'll grow into something greater than you can imagine." In the distance, the faint sound of Harlan's laughter echoed from the workshop. Silas smiled to himself, feeling a flicker of hope. This was only the beginning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields as Silas walked toward the workshop. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the faint metallic tang of oil and grease from inside. Harlan was perched on a stool near the workbench, meticulously reassembling a pair of rusted hedge clippers. The boy's focus was unwavering, his hands steady despite the fading light. Silas leaned against the doorframe, watching for a moment before speaking. "You know, most kids your age are glued to their phones or playing video games." Harlan smirked, but didn't look up. "Most kids don't have property taxes breathing down their necks." The words were light-hearted, but Silas caught the weight behind them. He stepped inside, pulling a chair closer to the workbench. "How's your grandpa doing?" Harlan paused, setting the clippers down. His face softened. "He's hanging in there. Some days are better than others. He doesn't complain much, but I can tell—" He trailed off, his voice tightening. Silas nodded. "He's lucky to have you." The boy shrugged, avoiding Silas's gaze. "It's just what you do for family. You don't think about it, you just do it." The sincerity in Harlan's voice struck a chord with Silas, reminding him of the bond he'd let slip away with his own father. The next day, as Silas and Harlan were organizing the tools in the workshop, a knock echoed from the farmhouse door. Silas opened it to find Deputy Ben Rourke, a broad-shouldered man with a kind but weary face. His badge glinted faintly in the sunlight. "Afternoon, Mr. Cormack," Rourke said, tipping his hat. "I'm here on a bit of official business." Silas's stomach tightened. "What kind of business?" Rourke sighed, pulling a folded notice from his pocket. "This is about the Drakes. Their property taxes are overdue, and the county's preparing to put their house up for auction if it's not paid by the end of the month." Silas's grip on the doorframe tightened. "Auction? They'll lose their home?" Rourke nodded grimly. "I hate to see it. Caleb's a good man, and Harlan's doing everything he can, but they're running out of time." Silas thanked the deputy, his mind racing as he watched the man retreat to his car. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on his chest. He'd seen desperation before, clients scrambling to save their assets. But this was different. This was about survival, about family. Later that evening, Silas brought up the conversation with Harlan as they cleaned up the workshop. "Harlan, I heard about the taxes," he said carefully, watching the boy's reaction. Harlan froze for a moment, then resumed stacking tools with forced nonchalance. "It's nothing I can't handle," he said quietly. "Harlan, I said it's fine," the boy snapped, his voice sharp and brittle. He turned away, gripping the edge of the workbench, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "I'll figure it out. I always do." Silas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't have to do it alone. There's no shame in asking for help." Harlan turned to face him, his eyes blazing. "You don't get it, do you? People like me and Grandpa, we don't get handouts. We don't get second chances. If we don't fight for what's ours, we lose it." The room fell into an uneasy silence, the only sound the faint creak of the wind against the windows. "I'm not offering a handout," Silas said finally. "I'm offering to help because I can, and because you deserve it." Harlan's gaze softened slightly, but the tension in his shoulders remained. "I don't need your pity," he muttered. "It's not pity," Silas replied firmly. "It's respect." That night, Silas walked the short distance to the Drake house, the faint glow of a single lamp visible through the window. Caleb sat in his usual spot by the fire, his hands resting on the armrests of his chair. "Evening, Mr. Drake," Silas said, stepping inside. Caleb turned his head toward the sound of Silas's voice, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Evening, Mr. Cormack. What brings you by?" Silas sat down across from him, the warmth of the fire easing the chill in his bones. "I wanted to talk about Harlan. He's carrying a lot on his shoulders." Caleb nodded slowly. "He always has. He's a fighter, that boy. Gets it from his mother." Silas hesitated before speaking again. "He mentioned the taxes. I want to help, but he won't let me." The older man's expression grew somber. "Pride's a tricky thing, Mr. Cormack. It's what keeps us standing when the world tries to knock us down. But sometimes, it also blinds us to the hands reaching out to steady us." Silas leaned back, Caleb's words settling heavily in his mind. "What would you do?" Caleb smiled faintly. "I'd do what my heart tells me, and trust the rest to sort itself out." As Silas walked back to the farmhouse, Caleb's words echoed in his mind. Trust the rest to sort itself out. He glanced back at the Drake house, its silhouette framed against the darkened sky. In that moment, he made a decision. Not just to help Harlan and Caleb, but to prove to himself that he could be the kind of man his father would have been proud of. The next morning, the autumn sky was a patchwork of gray clouds, and the air carried a faint chill. Silas stood in front of the county clerk's office, the notice about the Drake family's unpaid taxes clutched tightly in his hand. He had spent the entire night turning Caleb's words over in his mind, grappling with the best way to help without betraying Harlan's fierce sense of independence. When he finally walked through the door, the decision was made. The office was small, with aging wood paneling and the faint smell of musty paper. The clerk, an older woman with glasses perched precariously on the edge of her nose, looked up as Silas approached. "I'm here to settle the taxes on the Drake property," he said, sliding the notice across the counter. The clerk adjusted her glasses, scanning the paper. "You're not listed as the property owner," she noted, glancing up at him. "I'm aware," Silas replied, his tone firm. "I just want to make sure the debt is cleared." The woman hesitated for a moment before nodding. "It'll take a bit to process, but once the payment is made, the auction notice will be rescinded." Silas wrote the check, his hand steady despite the weight of what he was about to do. It wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a step towards something greater, a seed planted in the soil of his late father's values. 2 days later, Harlan burst into the workshop, his face flushed with anger. In his hand was a crumpled letter from the county, notifying the Drakes that their taxes had been paid in full. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice sharp as he slammed the letter onto the workbench. Silas looked up from a set of blueprints he'd been studying. "I paid the taxes," he said simply. Harlan's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "Why? I told you I didn't need your help." Silas stood, meeting the boy's fiery gaze. "You didn't need my help, but I gave it anyway. Not because I think you're weak, but because I respect what you're fighting for." Harlan shook his head, his voice trembling with frustration. "You don't get it. People like me, we don't take charity. We work for what we have. Always." "It wasn't charity," Silas said firmly. "It was a choice. My choice. Because I see something in you, Harlan. Something worth fighting for." The boy's anger faltered, replaced by confusion and a flicker of vulnerability. "What do you mean?" Silas stepped closer, his voice softening. "You've got more drive, more heart than anyone I've ever met. You're not just surviving. You're trying to make things better. For your grandpa. For this town. You reminded me of something I lost a long time ago. And this was my way of honoring that." Harlan sank onto the stool by the workbench, his shoulders slumping. "I just don't want people to think I can't take care of my own," he murmured. Silas sat beside him, his tone gentle. "People aren't going to see it that way. And even if they do, who cares? You're not defined by their opinions. You're defined by what you do, by how you live. And from where I'm standing, you're doing just fine." Harlan looked down at his hands, his calloused fingers twisting the hem of his sleeve. I don't want to lose him. Grandpa, I mean. He's all I've got." Silas felt a pang of sympathy, his own father's face flashing in his mind. "You're not going to lose him, Harlan. And even if the worst happens, you're not alone. Not anymore." The boy glanced up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. For the first time, he didn't argue. Later that evening, Silas stayed late in the workshop, tinkering with an old wood lathe as Harlan worked on a prototype for his tactile map. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the quiet hum of tools and the occasional crackle of the wood stove. As they cleaned up for the night, Harlan hesitated by the door. "Silas?" "Yeah?" The boy shuffled his feet, his voice low. "Thanks. For everything." Silas smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Anytime, kid." Harlan nodded. And for the first time, Silas saw not just a boy, but a young man learning to carry his burdens with grace. The next morning, Silas woke early, the sun just beginning to rise over the fields. He stood on the porch of the farmhouse, sipping his coffee as the world slowly came alive around him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, not in wealth, not in success, but in the quiet act of giving. And as the day unfolded, he knew there was still more to do. The autumn winds swept through the overgrown fields as Harlan guided Silas toward an abandoned workshop on the outskirts of town. The building stood at the end of a dirt path, partially obscured by tall grass and creeping vines. Its wooden structure was weathered, the paint faded and peeling, but its bones were solid, much like the spirit of the boy leading the way. "This was my grandpa's place," Harlan said quietly, his voice tinged with a mix of pride and sadness. "He used to build furniture here before his eyesight started going. Now it's just this." Silas stopped beside him, taking in the sight. The workshop was more than just a building. It was a testament to years of craftsmanship, to a life spent creating. "You said you wanted to help," Harlan added, glancing at Silas. "Well, this is where you can start." The inside of the workshop was dim, the air thick with the scent of sawdust and rust. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, casting slivers of light onto rows of dusty tools and unfinished projects. Silas trailed his fingers over a workbench, his mind racing with ideas. "This place has potential," he said, his voice firm. "It just needs a little work." Harlan snorted, crossing his arms. "A little? It's falling apart." Silas turned to him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "And you're the one who's going to help fix it." Harlan raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "Why would I do that?" "Because this isn't just about the workshop," Silas replied. It's about what it can become. A space where you can build, create, and help people, like you've always wanted. For a moment, Harlan said nothing, his gaze sweeping over the room. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, but don't expect miracles. Back at the Drake house, Caleb's condition was worsening. The old man spent most of his days resting in his chair, his breath slow and labored. Harlan tried to keep his spirits up, but the strain was visible in his every movement. One evening, as Harlan worked on a small project at the kitchen table, Caleb called him over. "Boy," Caleb said, his voice faint but steady, "I want you to promise me something." Harlan knelt beside him, his eyes filled with worry. "What is it, Grandpa?" "Don't let this place define you," Caleb said, gesturing weakly around the room. "You've got too much light in you to let it be snuffed out by walls and debts. Keep building, keep dreaming. Promise me that." Harlan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I promise." Caleb smiled faintly, his hand resting on Harlan's shoulder. "Good. That's all I need to hear." The next day, Silas returned to the Drake house, a plan already forming in his mind. He found Harlan in the backyard, repairing an old fence. "Harlan," Silas began, leaning against the post, "I've been thinking about the workshop." "What about it?" Harlan asked, not looking up from his work. "I want to help you restore it," Silas said. "Not just to fix it up, but to turn it into something bigger, a place where you can work, create, and maybe even teach others. A real workshop. What do you think?" Harlan paused, his hammer frozen mid-swing. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Silas replied. Harlan straightened, his expression a mix of hope and disbelief. "You'd really do that?" Silas nodded. "With your help, of course. This isn't just about me. It's about building something meaningful. Together." For the first time in days, Harlan's face broke into a smile. "All right, let's do it." That evening, they began cleaning out the workshop, clearing away years of dust and debris. Silas brought in a few workers to help with the structural repairs, while Harlan focused on salvaging tools and equipment. As they worked, Silas noticed a shift in the boy, a spark of excitement, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. It was contagious, fueling Silas's determination to see the project through. "You've got a knack for this," Silas said as Harlan repaired a broken plane. "Guess it runs in the family?" Harlan replied, a small smile playing on his lips. A week later, Caleb's health took a sudden turn. He was confined to his bed, his breath shallow and labored. Harlan spent every free moment by his grandfather's side, holding his hand and sharing stories of their progress on the workshop. "We're going to finish it, Grandpa," Harlan said one evening, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "And when we do, it'll be because of you." Caleb's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm proud of you, boy. Always have been. Always will be." Late that night, as Harlan sat alone in the workshop, he ran his fingers over a small carving his grandfather had made years ago. A lantern, its edges worn smooth by time. He placed it on the workbench, the words his grandfather always said echoing in his mind. "A man is measured by the light he leaves for others to follow." In the distance, the faint sound of Silas's car approaching broke the silence. Harlan looked up, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just building a workshop anymore, he was building a future. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden beams across Elmsworth. The once abandoned workshop was now bustling with life. Workers hammered, sawed, and hauled materials, their voices mingling with the sounds of construction. Silas stood at the center of it all, coordinating efforts while Harlan darted from one corner to the next, his boundless energy propelling him forward. The transformation had begun in earnest, and it was no longer just a workshop. It was becoming a symbol of hope, a place where the town's spirit could thrive. Silas had spent the past few days reaching out to old friends and acquaintances in Elmsworth, people who remembered Caleb Drake and his contributions to the community. The response was overwhelming. Eliza Harper, the diner owner, showed up with trays of sandwiches and thermoses of coffee for the workers. Greg Morrison, a retired carpenter, brought his tools and expertise, shaking his head with a smile as he examined the worn-down workbenches. "Caleb taught me half of what I know," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "It's about time we returned the favor." Even Deputy Rourke arrived, helping to carry in heavy beams and offering a steady stream of encouragement. "This isn't just a building," he said to Silas. "It's a reminder of what this town can do when we come together." Harlan watched the influx of people with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had always assumed that the world worked against people like him, but here were neighbors and strangers alike, offering their time and effort to help rebuild something he thought he'd have to fix alone. That afternoon, as Silas and Harlan worked side by side sanding down a weathered table, Harlan broke the silence. "I don't get it," he said, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Don't get what?" Silas asked, glancing at him. "Why everyone's helping," Harlan replied. "Half these people didn't even know Grandpa was still alive, and now they're here like they care." Silas paused, setting down the sandpaper. "People care more than you think, Harlan. Sometimes they just need a reason to show it." Harlan frowned, his brow furrowing. "I've spent my whole life thinking I couldn't rely on anyone, that if I didn't figure it out myself, no one would." "And how's that worked out for you?" Silas asked gently. Harlan hesitated, his shoulders sagging slightly. "It's lonely," he admitted. Silas placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Letting people in doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger. You can't build something great alone. Not a workshop, not a life. Trust me, I've tried." Harlan looked up at him, his expression unreadable, but for the first time, he didn't push back. That evening, Harlan returned home to find Caleb resting in his chair, his breathing shallow but steady. Harlan sat beside him, recounting the day's progress with excitement he couldn't contain. "We're almost done with the roof," he said, his voice bright, "and Mr. Morrison said he'd help us rebuild the lathe. It's going to be perfect, Grandpa." Caleb smiled faintly, his hand reaching out to grip Harlan's. "I always knew you'd make something of yourself, boy. I just didn't know it'd be this." Harlan's throat tightened. "You're going to see it, Grandpa. I'll make sure of it." But Caleb's smile turned wistful, his voice soft. "Maybe. But even if I don't, I know it's in good hands. You've got the light, Harlan. Don't ever let it go out." The next day, as the finishing touches were being put on the workshop, Harlan stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the people who had come to help. The walls were freshly painted, the tools neatly organized, and the air hummed with anticipation. Silas stepped forward, holding a small weathered box. "I thought this might belong here," he said, handing it to Harlan. Harlan opened the box to find a beautifully crafted lantern, its brass surface polished to a soft glow. Inside, an inscription read, "A man is measured by the light he leaves for others to follow." Harlan's hands trembled as he traced the words. He looked up at Silas, his voice breaking. "This was Grandpa's." Silas nodded. "He left it for you. And now, it's where it belongs." Harlan's vision blurred with tears, but he didn't try to hide them. He turned to the crowd, his voice steady despite the emotion in his chest. "This place isn't just for me," he said. "It's for all of us, for anyone who needs a second chance, a place to start over. That's what Grandpa taught me, that we don't just live for ourselves. We live to help others." The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. That night, as the workshop stood illuminated by the glow of the lantern, Harlan sat on the steps with Silas, the two of them staring out at the quiet town. "You were right," Harlan said, breaking the silence. "About what?" Silas asked. "About letting people in. It doesn't make you weak." Silas smiled, his heart full. "No, it doesn't." They sat there for a while longer, the lantern casting its warm light around them, a beacon of hope for the future they were building together. The first light of dawn bathed the workshop in soft hues of orange and gold. The building, once abandoned and forgotten, now stood proud, a testament to resilience, community, and the determination of a young boy with a dream. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet energy as neighbors shuffled about, admiring the finished space. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with tools in pristine condition. A workbench sat in the center, illuminated by the brass lantern Silas had returned to Harlan. The day marked the grand reopening of the workshop, not just as a place for craftsmanship, but as a hub for innovation, collaboration, and hope. Harlan stood near the front of the room, his hands gripping the edges of the workbench for support. The crowd that had gathered was larger than he'd expected, and he felt a knot of nerves twist in his stomach. Silas stood beside him, a steadying presence. "You've got this," Silas whispered. Harlan nodded, exhaling deeply before addressing the crowd. I never thought this day would come, he began, his voice steady but raw with emotion. For so long, I thought it was just me and Grandpa against the world. I thought asking for help meant admitting defeat, but you all showed me something I didn't believe was possible, that people care, even when they don't have to. He glanced at the lantern, its light casting a warm glow over the room. This workshop isn't just for me. It's for anyone who needs a place to create, to learn, or to rebuild. My grandpa always said, "A man is measured by the light he leaves for others to follow." This is my way of carrying that light forward. The crowd erupted in applause, their faces alight with pride and admiration. As the celebration wound down, Harlan returned home to check on Caleb. The old man was resting in his chair, a faint smile on his face, as he listened to the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation drifting through the window. "It's done, Grandpa," Harlan said, kneeling beside him. "The workshop is open. It's everything you taught me to be." Caleb's hand found Harlan's, his grip surprisingly strong. "You've done more than I ever could have dreamed, boy. I'm proud of you." Harlan blinked back tears, his throat tightening. "I couldn't have done it without you. Everything I know, everything I am, is because of you." Caleb's smile deepened, his voice soft. "Then I've done my job." Later that night, Caleb passed peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a legacy of love and wisdom that would guide Harlan for the rest of his life. In the days that followed, Silas found himself lingering at the workshop more and more. The farmhouse no longer felt like a relic of the past, but a part of his present, a place where he belonged. One evening, as he and Harlan worked late into the night repairing an old lathe, Silas broke the silence. "I think I'm going to stay." Harlan looked up, surprised. "In Elmsworth?" Silas nodded. "This place has given me something I didn't know I needed, a chance to make a difference, to honor my father's legacy, and to build something meaningful." Harlan smiled, his expression warm. "We'd be lucky to have you." The workshop quickly became a cornerstone of the community. Harlan began mentoring others, teaching them how to repair tools and create new designs. His tactile maps gained attention beyond Elmsworth, sparking interest from organizations dedicated to accessibility. Silas, meanwhile, used his connections and resources to support the workshop's growth. He established partnerships, secured funding, and ensured that the workshop would continue to thrive for years to come. One crisp autumn evening, Silas and Harlan stood outside the workshop, watching as the last of the day's visitors made their way home. The lantern in the window cast a steady glow, its light a beacon for anyone seeking hope and purpose. Harlan turned to Silas, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I used to think the world was just a place you had to survive. Now I see it's a place you can build." Silas smiled, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "And you've built something incredible, Harlan. Something that matters." Harlan nodded, his gaze fixed on the lantern. "We both have." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the two of them stepped back into the warmth of the workshop, ready to face whatever the future held, together. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.